views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Our very first program 21 years ago was about education. Since that time, we've done literally 100 programs about our borough's schools. Tonight, you can add one more. As we welcome in the new school year, we will present maybe the most fundamental issue that keeps our children from succeeding. Teacher quality, administrative talent and organization, proper resources, curriculums, they're all vital to making effective schools. But none of that means anything if our children are absent from school. And tonight's guests are going to present some numbers that will shock you and scare you. The chronic absence of Bronx children, especially in parts of the South Bronx, is beyond out of control. And it's become a serious problem that's virtually preventing our children from succeeding. How did it get that way, and how can we correct this most basic of issues? The children cannot achieve if they're not in school. It's a pretty simple concept, and that's our topic tonight, chronic absenteeism. We are on tape tonight because of the holiday, but if you have questions or comments, you send them in an email to BronxTalk@BronxNet.org or post them on the BronxTalk Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. But for the here and now, the co-director of South Bronx Rising Together and the director of Collective Impact for the Children's Aid Society, it is Fernandez. Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And the Community School Director of CS55 from SCAN, New York, Indira Marichal. Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's start with you. First of all, I think it's important to just introduce South Bronx Rising Together. I have been inspired by the concept. Some people know about it. Many people don't. I think it's time that everybody does. Who is South Bronx Rising Together?
Sure. Thanks, Gary. South Bronx Rising Together is a partnership of over 150 organizations, families, really any stakeholder in the heart of the South Bronx that cares about making sure that all kids are successful from the moment they're born all the way through college and career. And so we have a number of partners that have come together to agree to a common agenda to rethink the South Bronx as a place of opportunity where kids can be successful. And so we have a number of partners who are working together on thinking about what goals can we get around, really organize ourselves around, and how do we get the right projects in place to actually make sure kids are getting there. We're measuring data. It really is a way to organize all of our work in a way that makes sure that we're being accountable to each other and to all the kids of the South Bronx.
Is it obvious why we need to put something like this together? I mean, I could, off the top of my head, with barely even thinking about it, tell you some of the issues, but I guess it would be pretty obvious, right?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a lot of really good work happening in the South Bronx for decades. The problem is that sometimes they're sort of far between, and we want to get to a place where we understand what seems to work. We can lift up those good practices and make sure that more people are learning from that and doing it together. I think what's really critical is that's why we're called South Bronx Rising Together. We've done a lot of things sort of separately. Here's an opportunity to really learn with each other and from each other.
About how many people, or you mentioned some groups,
Sure.
I want to characterize it so people understand the size of the effort and the importance of the effort.
Sure. So we are focused on Community District 3. Which is right in the heart of the South Bronx, 80,000 residents, 25,000 of whom are under the age of 18. We're looking at 61 schools. So it's a pretty sizable group of people and a good chunk of real estate in the South Bronx. Over 150 partners right now are engaged, and that number grows every single day. And we anticipate right now we have about a mailing list of over 1,000 people who are getting regular updates who are finding ways to engage with each other in figuring out how we can work better together.
What we have communicated on this show through the years is that we are able to do things, that problems are solvable. What I have been inspired by is the notion of together, that all of a sudden, finally, all of us who say, you know what, we can't stand having things go wrong,
Sure.
we want to make them go right. All right, let's talk about schools. Why did this idea of chronic absenteeism rise to the top of the priority list for South Bronx Rising Together?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we have a number of goals in our work at South Bronx Rising Together. We have 7 key goals, things like all kids are healthy, all kids are succeeding in school, all kids are graduating high school, going into college, starting careers. And we have people really looking at the data under each of those goals to figure out what are some good next steps for us as a community to move forward. And one thing that came up over and over and over again was we can't really talk about 3rd grade reading or 8th grade math or college graduation or college access unless we make sure that kids are coming to school every single day. It just became really clear that we're not going to get much traction on any one of these projects if kids aren't in schools, in their seats, really getting what they need to be successful. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, the numbers of kids who are missing school in the South Bronx is really alarming.
You know, he used the words really alarming. I used the word at the opening, scary. Hang in there. You won't believe it. The numbers are somewhat outrageous, really, and that's why we're spending the time tonight. Indira, talk to me about why, in general, and we'll get to some specifics, why do you think kids are not coming to school, particularly in Community District 3 and in the heart of the South Bronx?
I think there are a lot of factors that come into play for that. It depends a lot on the age as well. For example, if we're talking about high schoolers, that's something that you can put more on that student. Why aren't you coming to school? They're old enough to be of age to get themselves up and ready in the morning, get out of the door, come to school.
Yeah, why aren't you coming to school?
Which is a bit different than dealing with an elementary school child where the onus is really on the parents, on the guardians of that child, because you can't put it on a 7-year-old that they're not getting themselves to school in the morning. So it really depends on what age group you're looking at. But factors that I've encountered throughout my years doing this kind of work have included being sick, whether it's a little bit sick or needing to go to the doctor sick.
And let me just add the asterisk to that. We're number 62 in the state of New York in health indicators. Many of those problems are, in the South Bronx. So they may be legitimately sick, not
Yes.
just calling in sick. Go ahead,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
So there's the being sick, there's the not placing of the appropriate value to education that once upon a time existed. So it's kind of downplayed that a kid is absent. Oh, he's just absent a couple days here and there. He's just absent one day. It's not going to make a difference. But they add up, and that's what people don't understand. So an absence here and there mounds up to a lot of absences, and that's the bit that people don't understand. With the lower grades, one of the things that I've encountered too in elementary school is that parents downplay the impact that it has on their education. They don't understand that it is a big deal if a kindergartner or a first grader misses school. It actually has even...
A parent doesn't understand that.
Some parents don't. I've encountered those parents. I figured it wasn't a big deal because it's just the first grade. I figured it wasn't a big deal because it's just kindergarten. And I had to help them understand that it's the foundation for everything. You can't get to college if you can't read and write and do basic arithmetic. You learn that in kindergarten and first and second grade. So it is a huge deal if they're absent then. But it's a matter of not understanding everything that really goes into a school day and not understanding everything that comes under instruction for a child. And they just think, because there's been such a big emphasis on testing, they figure school really starts mattering when the testing starts.
And so if they're not necessarily being tested in kindergarten or first grade, they think
There's a misconception there that it's not as big of a deal if they're absent.
How much of a deal is a perception, real or otherwise, that, you know what, the schools aren't that good anyway, and so on, I miss it, I'm not getting anything out of it anyway. Is that out there? I would think, especially for high school kids, that, so what, school's not, doesn't do anything for me anyway.
That is a huge deal. I spent 3 years. A huge deal. I spent 3 years working at a high school at an attendance improvement dropout prevention program. And I had a caseload of an average of 120 students every year that I dealt with. And they had an average of anywhere from 50 to 80 absences the previous year, but still got managed to be passed along to the next grade.
Wow.
Or we're repeating that.
Think about that, 50 to 80 absences. So if you have 5 days a week and you missed 50 classes, that means 10 weeks. That's 2.5 months you didn't go to school.
Yes.
Folks, that's only the beginning of the numbers we're going to talk about.
Yes.
Were you cognizant of getting your mind around the notion of absenteeism as a core issue before SBRT, South Bronx Rising Together, brought it up? Or like me, which I was not aware of it. I mean, I guess, superficially I might have been aware of it. Or like me, did it crystallize, wow, now I understand it because they really articulated the numbers?
I understood it on a micro level. But after that meeting, it's definitely a much more of a macro level understanding of how really far and wide this issue has spread. And it goes beyond the Bronx. So just here alone to see those numbers is staggering. If you looked at the city, that's scary.
Well, I can only deal with the Bronx, and that's what we do on Bronx Talk, so I'll take one problem at a time. Now, the meeting that Ms. Marichal is referring to is the summit that I attended. As you know, I attended. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about the participation, the enthusiasm around that, and what that was about. And that was instructive, too, for you and others, leaders, to figure out what path you need to take.
Absolutely. So we had a chronic absence summit in July of this year. And the idea was to really, as you may know, September is Attendance Awareness Month. It's a national movement started by a group called Attendance Works.
How long ago?
I think it started 2 or 3 years ago, doing this sort of national event. I don't know that it's really made its way to New York City quite yet, so we're really excited that the Bronx is putting New York City on the map.
Here we go.
And I should point out that Hetty Chang is a researcher behind Attendance Works, and back in 2008, she released a report that really put a lot of focus on this issue. And she pointed out that nationally, it's about 10% of kids who are chronically absent. But in some communities and some schools, it can be as many as 4 in 10 kids who are chronically absent. And what we found is that when you look at kids who've missed that much school, they're missing a lot of instruction. And by the way, it's for any reason, excused or unexcused. It's a really important point to make here.
Well, that's what I said, that they may be legitimately ill,
absolutely.
But that doesn't mean that they're actually attending school.
That's right. And whether it's legitimate or not, they're missing instruction. They're missing an opportunity to learn from their peers, to sort of be in a social environment. They miss a lot by not being in school.
Yeah, and let me just interject. So this dialogue is not only about some of the issues that we've already heard about, but it's also about keeping our kids healthier.
Absolutely.
And extending this conversation
That's right.
to larger issues as well.
That's right. And when you look at some of the issues in the South Bronx, we all know that asthma is a huge issue that we face here, that our kids face in this community. And so it makes sense that we're going to see more kids out for asthma than perhaps in other communities. That ends up having an impact on how many kids can go to school every day. So we can't just say kids come to school more often. We really need to think about how can we, from a public health point of view, make sure that kids and families have what they need to manage asthma, for example.
I'm going to interject, having not been prompted to it, but interject a couple of other issues that come up, and
Sure.
we know about it in the Bronx, that, you may have a housing problem.
Yes.
There may be a job or an employment problem.
That's right.
And they can't get the kids to school. They've got to appear in court, or they've got to go for a job interview, so they take the kid with them. And all of a sudden, some of the very basic structures of getting a child in education break down.
That's right.
And those are not related to the schools, or those are not related to those things, but all kind of putting together to create this very difficult picture.
That's right. And so I think it's too simplistic to say parents just have to do a better job at this. There are so many factors at play here that really make it difficult for families to make sure kids go to school every day. And exactly to your point, because there are so many issues, you can't just say schools fix this. We have to have lots of partners coming together to think about how can we, in partnership, looking at the same set of data, working with communities in a very deep, engaging way, identify the needs and respond very quickly. And so that's what the summit tried to do.
And that's why I was inspired by, you had more than 120 people,
That's right.
and they were school leaders and community
That's
leaders, and everybody was like, whoa, collectively, South Bronx Rising together, that's how we're going to do it. I do
Exactly.
want to mention Children's Aid Society and its Phipps neighborhoods.
Yeah.
They have been leaders in putting SBRT together, and we want to make sure they get the credit.
Thank you.
Although they're very happy to make sure that SBRT is successful and everything else will work out. Let's look at some numbers. You ready?
Sure.
Okay, these are, when I saw these, I said to myself, sitting there, that's why I have to put them on TV. So let's Dahlia, let's roll it, and let's see what we got here. The first thing we're going to look at is a map. Now, this map, obviously, is the city of New York, you can kind of see that right in the center, you can't, I don't know if you can tell on TV, the darkest numbers are the people or the places where there are the worst attendance, right? And that would be right in that part of the Bronx you're talking about.
That's right. So to be clear, to maybe just to define what chronic, how we're looking at chronic absence here, we're looking at the number of kids who've missed a month or more of school, about 10% of school or more.
A month or more.
Right.
Imagine like missing the month of October or something.
Right. So it ends up being about 20 days, 18 to 20 days a year, and once you hit that point, really negative outcomes follow. And so what this map is showing is that here are the 32 districts across New York City, and if you look at the districts in the Bronx, you see lots of red, so the deeper the red, the higher the rates of chronic absenteeism. And right in the heart of the South Bronx, you can see there we have some of the highest rates. So it's a clear signal that we have a real issue to work on here in the Bronx.
And right there in former School District 12, it says, the legend says that 30% of more of all schools' students are chronically absent.
That's right, and I should just point out that these are data that was presented by the New School in a report in 2008. They were connected to the Hetty Chang, and they realized that even though we had a 92.6% average daily attendance rate in New York City, for elementary school, we still had 90,000 kids who missed a month or more of school that year.
And I don't mean to laugh. It's insane. 90,000 kids. All right. So now the next graphic that we have starts to indicate very clearly that there's a problem. If you don't attend, you're not going to do well on tests and things like that.
That's right. So here's some data from a few years ago, but I still think the pattern probably remains that if you look at these two bars, the blue bars on the left, this is English language arts, and if we looked at the kids who attended well, it's still not great numbers. About a third of the kids who attended well are proficient or better on the statewide tests. But if you were chronically absent, only 11.4% of those kids tested proficient or better. So you can see both in ELA and in math on the right there, it's clear that showing up makes a difference. The more you show up, the better you do.
Same thing with the math. Now on the next slide, Dahlia, if we can go to the next, talks at the higher level, at the high school level. What are we looking at here?
Right, so the last one we looked at 3rd and 8th grade. Here we're looking at what happens for how many kids are college ready. And that's, passing regions at a certain threshold that they would not require remediation in CUNY.
So the lighter blue and then the lighter orange are the people who passed.
Correct. And those who are college ready are the darker colors to the right there. And you can see, again, the pattern remains that the more you attend, the better off you are. I should point out this is not causation, it's correlation, but it's still a pretty compelling chart to look at.
It's completely logical. And the next one I want to show, and this is the one, this one and the one after it are the ones that, this just absolutely blew me away.
Right.
And so let's go through it and be very clear about what we're looking at.
So again, we're looking at data from 2012, 2013, when SBRT released its baseline report last October. We were looking at data from that year, and we saw within looking at all the schools in our zone, so the heart of the South Bronx Community District 3.
That was in that 12 Community District 12 in the center of the Bronx and some of the surrounding.
It's a little bit of 12, a little bit of 9, and a little bit of 8.
Okay.
It turns out.
Those are the former school districts. Yeah.
Yes, and so if we look at the schools in there, we found, and looking at, well, how many kids in our community are chronically absent, we found that it's 35.5%, or it was that year.
Chronically absent,
Correct.
which means they've missed more than a
month or
of
more
school.
of school. That's
35%.
That's
okay.
right.
Don't lose that one yet. I appreciate you putting me back on TV, but I want to go right back to that. Go ahead.
And if you look at then, well, who's attending well? And so we're defining good attendance as missing less than 5%. And so, I mean, it's good news, I suppose, that 39.1% of the kids are attending well, but that number should be much, much higher, obviously. And in between those two groups are the at-risk kids, and that's a group we want to really, really pay attention to because it's so easy for them to slip into a chronic absence pattern.
Well, I also want to look at that, and if you add up the 35.5 and the 25.4, what do you get? You get 59, you almost get 60%, which would be the other part of the pie. That means 60% of the children pre-K to 12
Correct.
are either at risk or chronically absent, and that means only 39.1% have a chance to achieve in the way those other bar graphs show.
That's right. They're in much better shape to do well if they're showing up all the time. That's right.
All right, now just to get an idea of the grade breakdown, I want to go to the next one, and then Ms. Marichal, we're going to get to you, and I want to talk about some other items that I think about when I think about attendance. and why people might not attend. So this was also, to me, very revealing. What do you got?
So looking at the same schools in the same year, we did a breakdown by grade. And I think for the most part, I mean, I should have said this earlier, chronic absence is not the same as truancy. And the difference is that chronic absence is absent for any reason. Truancy typically is for kids who just decide not to go for whatever reason. It's kind of playing hooky, right? And so most people immediately assume that we're talking about an older population of kids, middle school and high school. What these numbers showed us, though, is that, and this is true really across the country, that some of the highest rates of chronic absence are actually in pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade.
Amazing.
And for reasons that we sort of talked about earlier, not all families realize the importance of kindergarten, the importance of pre-K. There are many things that get in the way of kids showing up. And in this case, these are not kids, as Indira mentioned, these are not kids deciding if they're going to go to school or not. It really is sort of parents having to make sure that they do what they need to do to get their kids in school.
Or as I mentioned earlier, and I'm not placing blame, but it could be that there are real legitimate issues
That's right.
in their lives, in their families,
Absolutely right.
in their structure of their housing,
That's
and
right.
the way they have to live that get in the way. There's no doubt about that.
That's right.
In the Bronx.
And we're not trying to blame parents for this. We're really saying let's understand what the needs are, how we can be supportive, and wrap those supports around parents to make sure that they understand the importance of it and they have the tools to get their kids to school every day.
One quick last look back at that graph, and then we're going to lose those forever and trying to come up with some answers. The other thing, which you look at 9, 10, 11, and 12th grades,
Yes.
I mean, those numbers are through the roof.
Absolutely.
That is just unbelievable.
Right, and it's impossible for us to know exactly looking at these particular numbers, but I would suspect that the kids who are really chronically absent in high school were probably chronically absent early in their lives. And so we think that, one of the best predictors of who will be chronically absent this coming school year is who was chronically absent last year. And so if we can figure out a way to get in front of this quickly, identify those kids who have a pattern of chronic absence, we might be able to change those numbers in a year or two, and that's why we're focusing on this issue so closely.
Indira, a couple of items for you then. How good a job are the schools doing? I know CS55 is taking this very seriously and is going to be part of a group that really takes a look at this. How good are the schools at tracking this attendance? If people like Fernandez want to come in and get drilled down a little bit and find out who it is, does that data exist, or are we still not even good at tracking this information?
The data does exist. Schools actually have their ATS system, which tracks the daily attendance, and they get to check the daily attendance rate by the middle of the day. So the schools have the data. It's a matter of pulling resources. So it's one of the great things with the South Bronx Rising Together is that it really does take that collective impact to really make a difference. Because if we do have, as you saw, the numbers are very high in terms of the chronic absenteeism, there's but so many people who can be out of the classroom, be out of the office to take that time to sit with that student, to sit with that parent and find out what it is that's going on. So the more partners that we have involved, the better it is. So there are schools that have success mentor teams that got started with the previous administration, with the mayor. They had a task force.
So they may have done a little better.
That's when they started really targeting it, when really noticing how much of an impact academically absenteeism had. So the schools have been addressing it on a smaller scale, but we all need the help and more resources to do more for the students and the families.
Mr. Fernandez mentioned something about testing and the notion of testing. Does this whole structure of testing now scare maybe high school students away and say, you know what, I can't deal with this? And are they disaffected because when they come to school, they feel like there's something that they don't enjoy or they don't feel as productive, and all they're doing is studying for a test? Is that part of it?
That is a part of it. Based on my conversations with elementary, middle, and high school students and parents throughout that as well, the fact that there's so much more of an emphasis put on testing than actual learning is a big factor. Because it seems like, well, all you care about is whether or not I pass this test. What about caring if I learn or not? Why am I going to remember this if all I'm being taught to is memorize something so I can get it on a test and then I forget it next time?
Two questions. We'll wrap it up in one because we're almost out of time. What would be your recommendation to parents and others who are watching us? And then the second thing is, what do we need to do really to turn this around?
I think my biggest advice to parents would be, don't be afraid to ask for and accept support. We all do things with support. I am a big believer that no one does anything completely on their own. I prefer to do things with help. I prefer the support. I prefer to know that I'm not standing on my own dealing with things.
So if something comes up, find help, Is there a way to get your child to school? Can you have the problem resolved? And there could be community partners like yourself who would get involved.
Exactly. So you find someone either in the school, if you don't feel comfortable having those kinds of conversations in the school, find someone outside, but definitely find someone who can help.
And from a systemic point of view, what do you think we need to do?
I think we need to put more of a focus on people and less of a focus on numbers, because without the people, there'd be no numbers to look at in the first place.
You are setting up you're getting the best of together, and,
Yes.
and you're really going to take a look at this. Why don't you tell people what that's about?
Sure. So following on what we did in July, the Chronic Absence Summit, we're asking schools and partners in the community to say whether they're all in. You know, will they create a learning community of schools in the South Bronx that can make this a real priority going forward this year and learn from each other and sort of build on what we know seems to work. You heard about success mentoring. We know that having a team of people looking at data every week makes sense. And so we hope to have this September be a really important time for us to focus on the issue.
And how do people get in touch if they want to get in touch? I think we just put some.
So you have that. We also have a hashtag. There is one for the national movement, School Every Day, and also Bronx Represent, BX Represent. Hashtag.
BX Represent and School Every Day.
Correct.
Listen, you guys are, in my mind, are real heroes in our borough of the Bronx. Fernandez and Indira Marichal, thank you so much for your great work. And let's just get them in school. Get them there, and then we can deal with all the other problems we got to deal with. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on the show tonight or anything going on in the Bronx, then you email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org, or you put them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of the program. We ask you to like Bronx Talk on Facebook. You can check out the archives at BronxNet.org. You'll find Bronx Talk on the lower right navigation bar. In addition to thanking our guests tonight, thanks to our producer Dahlia, the director Shirley, the Helen, and the cast of thousands around us. And we'll see you next week. Good night.
Body language can tell you all sorts of things. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911 and get them to a hospital immediately. Learn the body language and spot a stroke fast.
People think I'm trash, but they're wrong. Today I'm just an aluminum can, but one day I could be a stadium.
So, I got this new family, and I don't know what it is about this one, but she can't seem to put down that toy. Oh, and she even talks to it. Who's she talking